Okay, guys, welcome to the second part of the chapter Origin of Species. We're now going to talk about the process of speciation. How do new species arise? There are two types of speciation that we can recognize, two mechanisms through which speciation can happen. The first one we're going to talk about is known as allopatric speciation, and the second one is known as sympatric speciation. You need to know these terms and you need to be able to recognize the two types. They're pretty simple, so it shouldn't be very hard. Allopatric speciation refers to a type of speciation where a physical barrier arises between groups of a population, groups of individuals in populations, and therefore a interruption of the gene flow happens. Remember that we have talked about the first part of this lecture, how the interruption of gene flow ultimately is what determines the fact that groups of organisms that were belonging to the same species no longer can mate with one another. And so, therefore, remember, these kind of processes don't happen overnight, don't happen just in a few years. This is a process that happens over the course of mostly millions of years. Okay, so whenever there is a physical barrier that appears that separates a population in subgroups, and these subgroups cannot for some reason come in contact with one another, there is an interruption of gene flow and the speciation event comes into play. One example we can give of allopatric speciation is given, for instance, by two species of antelope squirrel that were separated by the Grand Canyon and the Colorado River. And we know these two species are very similar, most likely were the same species that underwent the process of allopatric speciation. We also have other examples. For instance, we know that following the end of the last ice age, which happened about 12,000 years ago, there were two neighboring mountains in which shrews, mouse-like insectivores, they developed, and nowadays we can find very similar species, but again, they're separated. The gene flow is interrupted. They cannot really mate with one another, and because of that, the two species, the species that are found in neighboring mountains, because they never really come in contact with one another, they're considered distinct species. Okay, there is a reproductive isolation there, and therefore all the conditions for the groups to be considered different species are in fact met. All right. So the other type of speciation we're going to talk about is the sympatric speciation. Remember, sym sounds like same. So this speciation happens in the same place. So there is no physical barrier, as shown in this picture, that appears anywhere in this group of organisms, but there are biological, ecological factors that intervene here. Okay, so no physical barrier whatsoever, but still speciation can happen. And we're going to talk about a very specific example, a very good example of this sympatric speciation. There was a study done that has determined that in fact this is a kind of speciation that can happen. A specific example refers to the Lake Apoyo here in Nicaragua, which actually formed after a crater left of an extinct volcano. If you look at this lake, Lake Apoyo, you'll find two species of cichlids. One is the Midas cichlids, which is a more bulky type of fish. And then you have the slender arrow cichlids, which are slender, they're thinner. And Alex Mayer, a biologist that got interested in these two species and how these two species arose in this lake, which was kind of like a newly, if you will, formed lake. And so he started studying the case as a biologist. And as I told you, the Midas cichlids are big body, they're powerful jaws, and they actually live more in the bottom of the lake because they mainly feed on snails on the bottom of the lake. While the slender, which are the thin cichlids, live in the open water, more on the surface, and eat insects larvae. So these are the Midas, and these are the slender. So Mayer studied especially DNA of these two fish and they species. These two species don't intermate. So did lots of studies, also compared the DNA of these two groups to DNA of neighboring lakes. And actually he concluded that these two species, not only they are very related, so they must come from a common group, but he also concluded that the Midas cichlids had invaded the Lake Apoyo after a hurricane coming from a neighbor, and they were coming therefore from neighboring lakes. And so the first group that arrived was more looking like the Midas cichlids, they were more bulky. And eventually there was a speciation event where the slender cichlids evolved. And I've just told you that, so I'm going to skip on. And so the slender cichlids evolved from Midas cichlids that were a little bit more slender, and they were able to kind of swim a little bit faster, a little bit better. So start living more than on the bottom. They start living more in surface of the lake. And so over time, over the course of many thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, they became more and more slender, and they started feeding more and more on insect larvae. Of course, there was no competition in that. They were finding a lot of food on the surface of the lake, more than on the bottom. And so over time, also the two groups of fish evolved mating preference and started keeping away from one another. And again, this is an example of a sympatric speciation event where in the same lake you have the evolution of two different species from an initial one. So it can happen, okay? It's the same place, there's no physical barrier. These two types of fish can in fact come in contact with one another, but now there are two different species because a phenomenon of speciation has happened there, sympatric speciation. Okay, now we're gonna watch actually this interesting video from the Amoeba sisters about speciation. We're going to reinforce the concept of sympatric and allopatric speciation. There is another video following. It's more video about birds here. We can also watch this video as well. They're both very nice and very informative. So I'm going to play this one first. And volume is not there.
So if you've seen our video,
Let's troubleshoot this one. Why there is no volume? Still no volume.
So if you've seen our videos before, you may know that one of us is a cat person.
That's weird. Okay, I'm going to play it from the internet.
So what happened last year? No one warned me about the dark side of weight loss. I was left with this extra skin hanging from my arms, my legs, my neck.
So if you've seen our videos before, you may know that one of us is a cat person. Well, the other one of us is a dog person. And when we were younger, we used to wonder, wouldn't it be cool to have one animal that is half dog and half cat, a dog cat? There was a cartoon we used to watch as a kid about that, although because of our TV reception issues, it never came in very clear. Hence our childhood of instead watching nature shows. As cool as a have cat, have dog animal would likely be, we need to understand that cats and dogs are different species. So what is a species? Well, organisms that are in the same species can interbreed, and their offspring can reproduce. That means the huge variety of domesticated dog breeds, they're all the same species, even though they can look very different. Same with domesticated cats. All the different cat breeds are still the same species. You can watch our classification video to learn about the hierarchy levels and taxonomy, but in this video, we're just going to focus on the level of species itself. Now, can two different species breed and have offspring? Yes. For example, let's consider the magnificent zonkey. Yes, it's a thing. It's a hybrid, actually, a cross between two different species, a donkey and a zebra. Pretty rare, but it can happen. They typically are going to be sterile, though. So even though the donkey and the zebra had the baby zonkey, that zonkey will not be fertile. Donkeys and zebras are different species, so this fits into that species rule. Speciation, which means the development of a new species, can occur when populations are reproductively isolated in some form. Why? Well, first, check out our natural selection video, which talks about natural selection as a mechanism of evolution and how change over time can lead to a new species. Our focus right now is to see how isolation can happen in the first place, which can give rise to speciation. If we're going to get a little more fancy, we could talk about two main types of speciation: allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. And here comes our disclaimer. In our short video clip, we are only giving some examples of isolation and how speciation can occur. In allopatric speciation, there's a geographic barrier that separates the populations. So while natural selection is acting on these populations, there is also some geographical barrier, like a river or a mountain, that keeps them from being able to interbreed and share the same gene pool. Eventually, over a period of time, there can be change over time in the separated populations, in their separated areas from mechanisms like natural selection or genetic drift. Over time, these populations can have significant genetic differences that may not allow them to interbreed, even if they were brought together. Populations separated geographically can form different species. You might think you would always need a geographic boundary to separate populations, but in sympatric speciation, the speciation happens in the same area, yet there's something else isolating them. So what is it? Well, it can be a lot of things. We'll talk about just a few of them now. Let's start with prezygotic barriers. That means barriers that occur before you can even make a zygote. A zygote is a fertilized egg, so a prezygotic barrier is not even allowing fertilization to happen. So of the prezygotic barriers, let's start with this first one, behavioral isolation. This is when species can have different behaviors, even very slight differences that can isolate them. For example, birds having different songs. Some only have a very slight difference, but this can prevent the males from attracting females of other populations. And these birds can look very similar. Appearances are deceiving. One of the common biology examples is the eastern and western meadowlark. Surprisingly, you can find them in the same area. They look so similar, but they are isolated by their behavior. Mates are attracted with a different song. Temporal isolation, species can breed at different seasons, years, even different times of the day. They may look very similar, but if they don't have the same breeding season, then you're going to have an isolation. Habitat isolation. See, even assuming that organisms live in the same area, that doesn't mean their habitats are exactly the same. You could have two species of amphibians living in the general same area, but if one prefers an aquatic environment and one prefers a terrestrial environment, that will be habitat isolation. Now, you can have post-zygotic barriers too. That means that mating and fertilization actually occurred because you have the zygote, a fertilized egg, but there's some barrier that separates the species even still. Remember our zonkey example? Well, that's a perfect example because the offspring is not able to reproduce. That's one barrier that separates donkeys and zebras. Sometimes offspring that are produced between two different species are very weak and they do not survive long. And sometimes if species interbreed, the offspring is not able to develop, even in very early embryonic stages, because there's a genetic incompatibility. All of these are post-zygotic barriers that can happen in the same environment. Now, in our short video, we want to point out 3 things. First, this is just a very few set of examples of isolations that can lead to speciation. We encourage you to explore the huge list of other isolation types that can lead to speciation. Second, species can be impacted by more than one type of isolation. And third, please understand that isolation itself is not the mechanism for the actual change over time. Change over time, which can occur in gene pools of populations, can be due to mechanisms like genetic drift or natural selection. For example, let's take the case of natural selection. Remember that variety naturally exists in the populations. However, genes in a gene pool that results in high fitness, meaning more offspring, can increase in frequency of the population, which can cause the population to change over time. Isolation is what separates the gene pools of species, so the mechanism acting on the populations is acting on them separately. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
Okay, I'm going to stop here. I'm not going to play the next video, but it's an interesting video. That shows cases of birds, speciation regarding birds. So you are invited to definitely watch that video as well. And I will see you next time, the next lecture.